Liss Sails the Atlantic by Liss Anderson. Chapter 1. Home Waters, Accidents at Sea. In the south of England, our home the Atlantic Ocean. Sailors in storm. Madeira, the Canary Islands. Tenerife, Cape Verde Islands. Rolling down to Rio. Shark hunting. Crossing the line. Christmas in the South Atlantic. The Monsoonin is an 18-meter ketch made of oak and was built in 1895. She was originally a French fishing smack, and as you know, the French are famous for building good ships. The Monsoonin is a boat of 23 tons net and 56 tons gross register. We sailed from Copenhagen on July 14, 1929, with able-bodied seaman Ehlers, ordinary seaman Carl, and our maid Kirsten. In addition, there was my father, Knud Andersen, my mother Helga Andersen, and Jan and Tur, my two little brothers. Jan was 6 years old, and Tur 3. My name is Liss. Father always calls me Fish, which is the name I like best, and I was 11 years old. But now I'm 12. Our dog Luff came too, of course. We had sold all our furniture and bought the Monsoonin because Father wanted to go to sea. The preparations had taken him several months, and Mother had worked herself to death almost. When we left Copenhagen, we hadn't a penny. First of all, we sailed round to various places in Denmark, Hajorn, Svendborg, and Falster, in order to say goodbye to our relations and friends. The last town we called at was Frederikshavn. We were going to lie there and get ready for the proper start. There we also took on able-bodied seaman Hans Andres Janssen from the steamer M.G. Melchior. He came from the Faroe Islands and was a very good man. We signed him on as quartermaster, which is something above the ordinary seaman. We stayed a week in Frederikshavn and then set sail, but we hadn't got beyond Skagerrak when we had to turn and sail back to Ska, in the first place because we ran into a southwesterly storm, which did a lot of damage, and secondly because nearly everybody was lying down, being seasick, and there was a terrible to-do. We stayed a week in Ska, and Kirsten, who had acted as cook and had been very seasick, wanted to leave. So we got a new maid on board who was a better sailor. But finally it was arranged that Kirsten should stay with us because she was such a good maid on shore. Our new maid's name was Alfhild, but we called her Alf for short. While Mother and Father and the others mended all the things which had got broken at sea, Jan and I were allowed to go ashore and explore. We took sandwiches with us and set off. Once we went and looked at the church, which is buried in sand, so that you can only see the spire, and that is now used as a landmark. The church was built in 1440. On that occasion, we also saw the Click Garden, where the King of Denmark always spends some time in the summer. On another trip we went right out to the Ska Lighthouse, which is often called the Long Jutlander. We walked to the very tip of Jutland and tried to stand with one leg in Skagerrak and the other in Kattegat. We also saw Holger Drachmann's grave. It was lovely there. After a few days we sailed from Ska and out into the Skagerrak again. Of course there was another southwesterly storm, but Father didn't want to turn back anymore, and the Monsoonen was pressed so hard that she sprang a leak, and we had to go back to Frederikshavn, whether we wanted to or not. Kirsten had been so seasick that she really couldn't stay any longer, and Alf didn't want to either, so instead we thought we'd get a man to cook. First of all, though, the ship had to be docked. Mother had been seasick the whole time since we had left Copenhagen, but Father said that one doesn't get seasick as easily in the Atlantic as one does in the Skagerrak and North Sea, and he therefore decided that Mother, Jan, Tur, and I should stay in Denmark while he sailed the ship to England. While we were in Frederikshavn, John, Tur, Alf, and I went to Pickerbacker. It was lovely there, and we had brought our supper with us, but we were terribly tired when we got home, because we had walked the whole way. We had been given money to take a train, but we thought it would be more fun to walk, and besides, Mother and Father had hardly any money themselves. In the daytime, I often climbed so high in the rigging that I almost reached the top, and I also did all my lessons. In Frederikshavn, Ellers got a message that his mother was ill, so he had to stay at home. Instead of him, we got an able-bodied seaman called J. Christensen. He had no other clothes than the ones he was wearing, but he was a man with his heart in the right place, and not afraid to help when we were in a fix, which often happened. He was 27 years old, and always full of fun, and in a good temper, and we were almost like one big family. A few days before the Monsoonen came out of dock, we got a cook on board. Now we had a full crew, and so Mother, Jan, Tur, and I went to Hajorno, where we stayed a week, and from there to my grandmother's in Horsens, where we also stayed a week. One day a telegram came from Father. Arrived, Falmouth. All right, come soon. We packed our trunk the same day and left on the next day at noon. Grandmother came with us to Esbjerg to say goodbye. There we went on board the steamship Fyland, and it sailed afterwards. It was about 5 o'clock then, and after we had waved goodbye to Grandmother, we went to bed immediately. Next evening we sighted land, and soon after the pilot came on board, though it took us another whole hour before we came in to Harwich. When the boat had been made fast, the captain came and showed us which train we had to take to London. It took us a few hours to get there, and then it was already very late. We spent the night with a very nice old Danish lady. In the evening, when we drove through the town, we saw some very peculiar trams. They had no second carriages attached, and they were all two-storied. Some ran along lines, and others were more like motor cars. What surprised me the most, though, was that there were no tall houses. I had thought that the whole town would be full of skyscrapers. I was very disappointed about that, but we soon saw many other remarkable things. Next day we had to go on to Falmouth. It was a very lovely trip. We passed through green fields and over hills. We also passed through a few small mountains. In many places the ground was quite red, and at first I could not understand why that was, but Mother explained to me that it must be the earth itself which was that color. Yes, it was very beautiful in the south of England. We saw many rivers and old castles, and some of England's famous manors, and we saw sheep grazing in green meadows. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we passed a beautiful old town called Truro. That is to say, the train went along on a mountain and the town lies in a valley. In some places we were quite close to the sea and saw beautiful red cliffs which rose steeply over the water. Yes, it is beautiful in the south of England. That one can't deny. Not long after that, we got to Falmouth. Here we ran straight into Daddy's arms. He was waiting for us. It was pouring with rain then, and Father hired a taxi which took us down to the harbor. There were Christensen and Carl with the boat, and they rowed us out to the Monsoonen, pulling hard at the oars. It took a good half-hour before we got on board, because it was a long way off, and the wind simply blew. When we got far enough to see our ship, we discovered that she was flying all her signal flags. They were strung from the bowsprit end right over the main and mizzen tops to the stern. That was in our honor, Mother, Jan, Ch1, and me. At last we were on board, but even then we were not quite at home, for our home was the Atlantic Ocean. It was too lovely being on board again, able to go up aloft, to row or scull the boat, and once more to be playing all the games Jan and I played last time. Several times I went ashore with Father, and it seemed so funny to me that everybody was speaking English, but I got more and more used to it, and as I had learnt some at school, I soon began to be able to speak it a little as well. What I thought most fun in Falmouth was the 6-penny stores. You can buy almost anything you want there for 6 pence. You can buy a mouth organ, and even a gramophone record doesn't cost more than 6 pence. Father had promised all of us that we should go one Sunday in a steamer up the River Fall, at the mouth of which Falmouth lies, and that is why it is called Falmouth. Yes, Ch1 and I enjoyed that Sunday most awfully. We brought sandwiches with us, and Alfred, our cook, took his gramophone, so it was a lovely trip up the river. The river was very narrow, and on the shores stood beautiful forest. At some places we passed the ruins of old castles, which were standing on the highest hilltops, and it all seemed to me to be almost like an adventure. We sailed up to the small old town, Truro, which has a beautiful big cathedral. We went in and looked at it. The inhabitants in this little town are Catholics. After that, we were allowed to sit in a little tea shop and eat our sandwiches. We also drank coffee, and Alfred played his gramophone. Then we went for a walk round the town, and finally we got into an omnibus and went a good long way out into the country. There a Cornish woman rowed us out to the river steamer, because it was low tide, and after that we had a lovely trip home. Not far from us lay the famous English full-rigged schooner, the tea-clipper Cutty Sark. Once upon a time she could make 18 knots. When we were living in Denmark, Father had promised me that I should see her sometime, so his promise was now fulfilled. In the evening, Father told me about his voyage across the North Sea. It had taken 15 days. Of course, Father hadn't had a penny to pay for the Monsunen when she was in dock. But the man who was in charge of the wharf was very kind, and he gave Father credit till we are rich, for I'm sure we shall be rich one day. But then Father wants to pay long before that happens, he says, and Mother also agrees with him about that, because otherwise it may never come to anything. All the workmen at the wharf also wanted very much to help Father, so that he could get started on his voyage, and Father got the work done very well. On September 13th, we left Frederikshavn, Father told me, and this time we also got past the Ska. We had good weather for a few days, but only a little wind. One day Ch1 caught a tunny fish, and you can understand how pleased we were to get fresh meat. Off the Dutch coast we ran into a violent storm, and got carried towards land far to the inside of the Hawk lightship. We rolled so much that my big heavy writing table stood right over on one side. Then we didn't go to bed for several nights, but we weathered it all the same. One day when we were in the channel, there was a fog, and we heard a bell buoy not far from us. We put out the boat, and I rowed over to it with Ch1 and Cookie. They crawled up onto the big buoy and sounded the bell, and then I took a photograph of them. As I was saying, after a 15 days voyage, we dropped anchor in Falmouth Harbor, and not long after, I had you all on board, Father ended. Our crew came without pay, for we had nothing with which to pay them. But if Father had 2 shirts and one of the crew none, Father would give him one of his. They were a first-rate crew. Alfred couldn't manage very well to cook food, and also wash up, so we had to have a cabin boy. Mother, you see, was seasick. Father telegraphed to Denmark for a boy of 17, and a few days later Victor arrived. There were some nice people on land called Warnford, and one day we went on shore and paid them a visit. Cookie's birthday was on October 14th, and that day I was so high up in the main rigging that I could touch the truck. I had already been to the top of the mizzen mast when we were in the Kattegat. Of course, I had also been out on the bowsprit, and since I was down at the keel when the Monsunen was in dock at Frederikshavn, I have been in every conceivable place in the ship. At Aalborg Wharf, the hold of the Monsunen had been rebuilt into a saloon and several cabins, for of course the fishing smack was now to be a pleasure boat. Father had drawn up plans of the whole accommodation, but he received much good advice at Aalborg, and everything was done so well by the people there that you might have thought they were going to sail the ship themselves. And the manager of the wharf came down every day to see that the work was done nicely and sufficiently solidly. Ch1, Christensen, and Carl slept aft in the former skipper's cabin. In front of their cabin stood the WC and the pantry. Next to the pantry and in front of the WC, there was a cabin for father and mother, and in front of that and the pantry there was the saloon, with the piano and all that sort of thing. Then came Alfred and Victor's cabin, on the starboard side, in front of the saloon, and Jan, Tur, and I had a cabin on the port side. In front of these two cabins was the storeroom, and then came the former crew's forecastle, in which we now kept paints, anchor chain, paint brushes, and all kinds of bottles, ropes, and things like that. Besides the storeroom, there were in Alfred's and in my cabin and in the saloon little cupboards in the bulkheads. We kept tinned food in these. From Falmouth we sailed to Madeira, and I will now tell a little about that voyage. We left Falmouth on Sunday, October 29th. We got up early and watched the crew set sail. Soon after we left, it was pouring with rain, and the wind was getting up more and more as we sailed. It was not a favorable wind either, and drew farther and farther ahead, while Mother, Tur, and I sat aft, and were as sick as we could be. All the fishing trawlers sought shelter, as it wasn't worth our while to sail in such a wind. It was finally decided that we too should seek shelter. We turned and then got the wind almost dead astern. After that we were not seasick any longer. In the afternoon we tacked up and down the bay outside Falmouth until we got a better wind towards the evening, and stood out to sea in a proper squall. During the night we ran into a storm between the Lizard and the Scilly Islands, and shipped a heavy sea which smashed our lovely jolly boat, so that was lost now, but luckily the lifeboat was left. We ran into 4 storms on that voyage. In one the dining table lost a leg, and even though the table was fastened to the floor, it toppled over. So then we had to lash table and chairs in a corner of the saloon, until one day Carl mended it during his watch below. This was almost a nuisance, because we thought it much more fun to sit and eat off the floor. I was seasick the first 4 days, and after that Jan and I had our lessons every morning on deck. We had storms and rain almost all the way from Falmouth, and if it hadn't been for the cook and his gramophone, I don't believe we should ever have got across the Atlantic, much less home again. In the worst possible weather, Alfred sat with his gramophone on his lap and played the Victory March of the Monsoonin. I lift up my finger and I say, "Now, now," and so on, or as we said it, "Meow, meow," and when the cook was fooling, then we just laughed till our tummies ached. He put on father's old top hat, made his nose black on the bottom of the coffee pan, painted his lips red with fruit juice, dressed up in funny clothes, and put a funny record on the gramophone. He pulled such faces, it was screamingly funny. When Jan and Tur told the cook about our garden, and the land monsoon, as we called the house we lived in on shore, and about Granny, our aunts, Hanson, the fisherman, and Ch1, the grocer, and about all the others. Then the cook made fun of them and said to Jan, Tur, or myself, or maybe to his very good friend Luff, "Now when you get home to Mary's pear tree to the left of the rose beds, or won't you run round to Ch1 on the corner and get a quarter of coffee?" During the whole of the journey, Alfred made us laugh like that, but he didn't only make us laugh, he could also make us good food, even when the storm was howling about our ears, and he often helped up on deck when there was trouble. For example, when we were reefing or setting sail, and in very bad weather, he would sometimes go up on deck in the middle of the night and help to steer. On the whole, the crew kept terribly well together, and I don't believe I have heard them quarrel properly once all the time we were on board. They might start, and then someone would make a joke. They were nearly always joking with each other. One day we saw a topsail schooner sailing towards us. She looked very fine. As soon as we sighted her, we altered our course and steered towards her. When we had come close enough, we saw that she was a Portuguese, and we signaled to her to ask what was our longitude, because we had no chronometer, but Father's calculations turned out to be quite correct, though the storm had tumbled us around for 10 days. When we had come quite close to the schooner, Mother took a photograph of her. A few days before, we got to Madeira, while Jensen and I were down below having coffee. We suddenly heard somebody cry out. Jensen and I ran up on deck, for he thought we were running into a squall, but when we got up we saw that there were a lot of tunny fish. Jensen, of course, ran to fetch the harpoon, but as we had seen none for a long time, his harpoon was not in order, and though it only took him 2 minutes to get it ready, it was too late, and we caught no tunny that time. Still, we often had tunny steak and rissoles, for we had a whole cask full of tunny from the North Sea. I was terribly pleased that we were coming to Madeira, and on Sunday morning, November 3rd, we could see Porto Santo, the island which lies close by. Soon after Madeira came in sight, and it really looked very pretty with its high mountains. From a distance, the white houses looked just like grazing cattle. Shortly before entering the harbor, we were sailing at 10 miles an hour. I looked at the log and at the clock. We came under the lee of a steep mountain, which was almost 500 meters high. The mizzen stood taut, but the sails forward of it were flapping, and suddenly we were there. In the afternoon we went into Funchal, the town where we had anchored. Afterwards we had coffee on deck. Cookie played his gramophone. A little later, some boys came out in a rowing boat. They were wearing nothing but a thin pair of knickers, and wanted us to throw money into the water. The minute we threw out a coin, one of the boys would dive in, and soon after come up with it. Then we amused ourselves by throwing out to them old broken combs, and all sorts of other things. They swam under the monsoonin for a pipe and an old alarm clock, which wouldn't work, and one of them dived from almost the very top of our main mast for a pair of my old goulashes, which had big holes in the soles. That day we had a lot of fun. Many other people also came sailing out to us in their boats, wanting to sell fruit, beads, parrots, wicker chairs, and canaries. One day I was taken to the market by father and mother, and there we, Jan and Tur, were also with us, were allowed to taste roasted chestnuts, bananas, and other kinds of fruit, of which I don't even know the names. But I do know that on that day we ate cactus fruit. Another day we all went by motor car to a town called Santa Cruz up in the mountains. It was fun driving there. At first we drove very quietly, but suddenly the road went down so steeply that I thought we were driving straight out into the air. And in some places we had to jam the brakes on so quickly that we almost turned over. There were plenty of wild flowers growing on the mountain sides, and all kinds of cactus, which looked very queer. At last we got to Santa Cruz and went to a restaurant, where we sat in a garden and ordered wine and cakes. But Jan, Tur, and I drank fizz. Afterwards we went for a little walk. A Portuguese called Jose, who had given us many little presents, had also come with us, and he gave us each a fruit called mango, and some nuts, but I can't remember what they were called. Soon after we drove home again, and were back on board at 5 o'clock. In Funchal the streets are paved with small round stones, and instead of driving in carriages, the people use sleds, with iron runners. They are not pulled by horses, but by mules or donkeys. One Sunday, Father, Carl, the cook, and Victor went right up on top of one of the mountains, and did not come back till the evening. We went into the water many times a day, and on some days I went in half a dozen times, for it was so hot there that I was wearing nothing but a thin pair of summer knickers, and soon became as brown on my body as the native Portuguese. On Wednesday morning, November 13th, I helped to make ready for sea, and after we had eaten, we set sail and steered towards the Canary Isles. The sea was almost still, and so it took some time before the Monsoonin was her old self again. But we had hardly got a little way from land when the sky became clouded over, and we ran into squalls. Next morning we could see Great Salvage, an island where there are huge numbers of wild rabbits, and where we were to put in. But there are so many rocks, and the wind blew so hard, that Father didn't want to run any risk by trying to land, and also the island is uninhabited, and there is no anchoring place. Next morning we sighted land. It was the island Gran Canaria, and we reached it so early in the morning that we dropped anchor before breakfast. The bay in which we lay was called Gondo. The weather wasn't very warm, because the wind was blowing from the northeast and right over a flat peninsula. On the coast were many shacks and wretched hovels. The latter looked as if they had been ravaged by fire, and the inhabitants hadn't wanted to rebuild them, but had merely raised some of the half-burnt boards out of the ruins. Gosh, how happy I was to be getting ashore again. Here we painted the Monsoonin brown, and white inside, and white outside. That made her look very smart indeed, she who had been looking so black before, and soon anyone would have thought that she was a real pleasure yacht. On Sunday morning, we all rowed ashore except Jensen, Alfred, and Victor, who didn't want to go till the afternoon. When we got on land, Christensen and Carl left us. They wanted to try and find a place where they could buy bananas, but they had no luck, because all the bananas on Gran Canaria are sold to other countries. Mother, Father, Jan, Tur, and I went for a walk. We passed a big castle, and then we climbed right to the top of a mountain, which in the olden days had been a volcano. There were big blocks lying all down its sides. We also paid a visit to the huts. There was only one room in each of them, and they were terribly filthy. We took photographs that day and were allowed to have 2 donkey rides. It was great fun, and I rode a long way ahead of the others, all by myself. We also saw an old castle. Just before going back home, Father bought us each an orange, which we ate at once. They only cost 3 ore each. When we had eaten them, Jensen came and fetched us in the boat. In the evening, the sole of my right foot started to ache. That was probably because I had been walking barefoot on deck in the hot sunshine, and I had to jump about on one leg the whole of Monday. On Tuesday, Father, Jan, and I were to have gone ashore to a town which lies far up in the mountains, but I was no better and couldn't go. They left about 9 o'clock, and didn't come home till late in the afternoon. Jan had taken off his sweater, and Father had tied it up with string at the bottom, and then they filled it with oranges. They had eaten as many oranges as they could eat on the way, and in addition they had got, well, there must have been at least 50 oranges there, all for 75 ore. Gosh, how we ate! They were all so big and sweet, and Father and Jan had watched them being picked. Soon after we saw a lot of fish, and caught 2 of them. They were a kind of dolphin, and looked very pretty when they changed color, as that kind of fish does. In the evening, 2 Russians paid us a visit. They were wandering about in search of adventure, and were very nice. They used to be divers, and were going to dive for a treasure, which was lying a bit farther out at the bottom of the sea. One of them could speak a little German, and the other a few words of English, French, and Spanish. They both knew, so we mixed all sorts of languages, and understood each other very well. They brought a gramophone, and many lovely records. We shall never forget those 2 Russians. Next morning, at about 4 o'clock, we sailed for Las Palmas, a town which is also situated on Gran Canaria. The weather was lovely, but there was hardly any wind. However, when we had been sailing a bit, the wind freshened and swung over to the southwest, so that it was favorable. At 8 o'clock we got to Las Palmas, but by then it had already been dark for some time. Next morning we got up to look at the town and see what it was like, and it looked as if it might be very unpleasant. Later on in the morning, a whole lot of people came out in boats. They wanted to sell fruits, and all kinds of things, just as at Madeira. One of them had puppies to sell, and Mother bought one in exchange for a tin of cocoa. For the people here are very fond of cocoa. The man said that the puppy really cost half a guinea. It was so sweet, only a little pup, black with white spots and a light brown patch on one side of its head. It looked like a bear. On the very same day we sailed for Tenerife, because we had only put in at Las Palmas in order to collect any letters that might be waiting for us, and to paint the water line. But there was such a heavy swell that we couldn't paint it. On November 22nd, we arrived at Tenerife. Long before we got there, we could see the topmost peak of the islands, which is 3,760 meters high, and is always covered with snow. It was splendid. Our voyage was most enjoyable. The mountains rose high into the sky, and they were steep and covered with low bushes. They stood almost straight up out of the sea, and were separated by small valleys. The whole scene looked particularly lovely at sunset, for it was sunset when we arrived. When we entered the harbor, the pilot came out in a little boat, and jumped on board to pilot us in, but Father protested, for we had no money, as I have already explained, and Father never employs pilots. When Father told him that, the pilot was very quiet for a little while, and then he said that once upon a time he too had sailed in sailing ships, and was very fond of them, and he didn't care about money at all if only he could be allowed to stand on the deck of a sailing ship once again. The pilot was called Falavera, and he was a very nice Spaniard. Next day he took Jan and Tur for a sail in his boat. On Sunday, November 24th, we were all invited for a trip up into the mountains by a Danish man called Nielsen, who came from Krakow on Falster, but I couldn't go, as I had to stay in bed with my bad foot, and Mother, Tur, and Christensen also stayed at home. The day before we left, a sort of air bubble had come up under the skin of my foot, and in the evening Mother pricked it, because of course we couldn't afford a doctor, and anyway Mother is just as good, Father says. A lot of dark matter poured out, and then we discovered that I had got a splinter in my foot, and it had become a boil. After that day my foot became better and better. Monday evening, November 25th, we sailed for the Cape Verde Islands. On the night before we came to Saul Island, our little dog, whom I called Pudsig, fell over the stern and was drowned. That made me terribly sad, of course. During the watches, the men used to put him inside their shirts, and there he would hang over the belt, as if he was in a little bag. Pudsig loved that. The sun shone almost every day. There was hardly any wind at all, and it was generally hot. One day we thought there was a shark underneath the monsoonin. We couldn't see it, of course, but one of those striped pilot fishes kept on swimming alongside us all the time, and they always followed the sharks. We quickly got the shark hook ready and a line for the pilot fish. Twice we almost caught the pilot fish, but it got away. Then Father said he didn't believe there could be a shark there at all. As the meat hadn't been eaten, he thought that the pilot fish was probably only looking for a shark, for when pilot fishes are doing that, they like to follow ships because of food. The following day, we came into the trade winds proper. The wind grew stronger, and we saw large schools of flying fish. In the night, 4 small ones had fallen on the deck. Mother ate them for dinner, and I was given one to taste. They are very nice, almost like herrings, and they have some funny flying fins, which you can use as bookmarks. One morning we came to the first of the Cape Verde Islands, which is called Sol. The bay where we anchored is called the Bay of Morderia. Father had read that there were plenty of fish in that bay, and as soon as we had cast anchor we started to fish. We had several bites, but the fishes let go again every time. At last Jensen caught one, but it was poisonous. Whenever we caught any fish, we always used to boil its head first of all together with a silver spoon, and if the spoon turned black, then the fish was poisonous. There were plenty of fish all right, but they only bit off the bait, or nibbled at it, so they were probably not very hungry. The island wasn't very high. There were only a few hills, including one which is called the Lion's Head. Because it looks like the head of a lion. Plenty of turtles are supposed to come ashore here, but I believe only the natives know when they arrive. 2 days later, the grown-ups were going ashore to have a look around, but Carl and Christensen remained on board. However, Mother and Father and the others in the boat never succeeded in getting ashore because the surf was too rough, so they had to row back soaked through. When they had got back on board, and we were all sitting drinking coffee, we suddenly heard a crash. It turned out to be the anchor chain, which had snapped, so that now the boat was drifting. We hurriedly set sail and left for Porto Grande, a town on the island of St. Vincent. By the next morning we were already there, but we only put in to post some letters, and while Father was seeing to that, Mother swapped some tins of cocoa, which couldn't have kept very long in the heat, for masses of oranges. Soon after we weighed anchor and set our course for Rio de Janeiro. The distance is about 3,000 nautical miles, and 1 nautical mile is 1,852 meters. When we left Porto Grande, a fresh trade wind was blowing, and we succeeded in beating a steamer. We were making 10 knots, but it soon overtook us again. The first night at sea, 60 flying fish fell on deck, and the second night, 90. We were looking forward terribly much to reaching the equator, for then we were going to be baptized. But other things also happened which we enjoyed very much, and they were: one day it was calm. It had been like that anyway for several days already, because we had got into the doldrums, the region between the northeast and the southwest trade winds, where it is always calm. Some time in the afternoon, the cook suddenly came running and shouting, "A shark! A shark!" And, of course, we rushed aft, and saw a large shark in the sea. One of us at once ran down and called the watch below. One ran to fetch the shark hook, another a strong line, and the cook came with a piece of meat big enough to catch 3 sharks. The shark hook was a piece of steel, bent and with a very sharp point, almost 60 centimeters long, and about 3 centimeters thick. A short, strong iron chain was fastened to the hook, and the stout line was fastened to the iron chain. We lowered the hook with the meat into the water, fastened the line inside the ship, and were then waiting for one thing only, and that was for the shark to bite. Father said it was a blue shark. It swam fairly slowly round the hook for about 5 minutes, before at last it turned on its back. We all became very excited, for a shark must always turn on its back to get hold of its prey. But it only bit off a small piece, and as the minutes went by, we became more and more excited. Then the shark turned over on its back once again. In a twinkling, it closed its jaws, with there 7 rows of teeth on the hook, and Father at once jumped up and fetched another strong line, on which he tied a noose with a running bowline knot. Very carefully we loosened the line, which had the shark at the end of it, and slid the noose on the other line over the shark. But in order to get the noose over the fins and down over the tail, we had to pull the shark up a bit. As soon as we started to pull, the shark began to toss about so much that we could hardly hold it, but we managed to get the noose round its tail. It was in the nick of time too, for the shark had jerked about so much that it had straightened out the heavy hook. We removed the hook altogether, and then the shark was hanging only by the line round its tail. We had, of course, made that line fast, but we realized clearly enough that we shouldn't be able to pull up the shark with our bare hands, so we had to fix a tackle in the mizzen rigging, and then the shark was pulled up. It jerked about so much at the end of the line that its blood squirted in our faces. While we were pulling it up, Jan, Tur, and I had to go right forward and stand by Mother, and she held Tur pressed tightly to her. She was so afraid that the shark would bite us that she hardly dared to look at it. But Father asked Mother if I couldn't be allowed to come a little bit closer, and I was allowed to do that. At last we got the shark on deck, and it lay there and flopped about while the blood was squirting out of it. It was a huge fish, and when it was killed we measured it. It turned out to be 14 feet long. The line we had put round its tail had somehow got into its mouth, and we tried very cautiously to take it out, but the shark noticed that, and snap, bit it through. When we had got the shark on deck, we first of all hit it on the head with an axe to make it unconscious, and then Jensen pushed a board under its tail, took our biggest axe, and with 3 blows chopped its tail off. When a shark has had its tail chopped off, it is no longer so dangerous, for then it can't hit. After that, we hit it on the head till it was dead, and then we cut it open to see if it had eaten any sailors recently, but it didn't seem to have had anything to eat for ages, for in its stomach it only had the pieces of meat it had bitten off our hook. We cut out its backbone and jaws, for those we wanted to clean and take home. One can make a lovely walking stick from a shark's backbone, and a jaw from a blue shark with 7 rows of teeth is well worth having. After that we pitched the shark overboard, and at once there came a lot of pilot fish. A pilot fish is a small fish no larger than a mackerel with vertical stripes. It follows the shark like a little servant, or pilot, and even though it isn't poisonous, it can swim right inside the shark's mouth without the shark doing it any harm. When the shark catches sight of something it thinks will be good to eat, the pilot fishes. They mostly swim 2 or 3 on each side. First swim along and take a look at it or taste it. Then they swim back and tell the shark whether it is good, prey or not. And if it is, the shark swims and catches it. Our pilot fishes followed the shark when it sank, but they couldn't follow it for very long, because they are used to living almost right at the surface with the shark. We boiled the set of teeth and the backbone before we cleaned them, because that made the meat easier to scrape off, but we ought not to have boiled the jaws, because the teeth fell out. That didn't matter so much, because anyway the hook had broken the jaw, so we picked out all the teeth, and Father kept them. Next day the sea was teeming with baby sharks, and we caught one 4 feet long. A few days afterwards, we were told that we were at the equator, and that Father Neptune would probably come on board in the afternoon to pay us a visit, and at about 12 o'clock I helped Jensen to pound the line under our keel with a boat hook, so that Jan should believe that Father Neptune was real. There is no real line, of course, but Jan and Tur both thought they could see it, because we had made them believe that there was one. A little while after dinner, we were told to go down into the saloon, because Neptune was coming. He could already be seen forward. Soon after we were called on deck, and then I saw the funniest sight one can imagine. So funny that in all my life I have never seen anything like it. Everybody was nearly bursting with laughter. We saw Neptune with his wife and Dr. step over the bows. Neptune held a log book in one hand and a trident in the other. On his head he wore a big golden crown made of tin, and it was ornamented with red string. He also wore a long beard and a mustache, and there was a belt of plaited rope round his waist, and plaited string round his legs, below the knees. He had on a thin woolen vest, and a pair of bathing drawers. It was Father who had dressed up as Neptune. Neptune's wife wore a light-colored stocking on one leg, and a dark stocking on the other. She too had tied string round her legs, and some round her tummy, to keep up the apron she wore over her bathing costume. She had very long, thin hair made of rope, yarn, and on her head something which was meant to look like a wash tub. A little stick was fastened on each side of the tub. A piece of string had been tied from one stick to the other, and from it, attached by 2 clothes pegs, there hung a little piece of cloth that was her pet boy's Sunday shirt. In one hand Miss Neptune was holding a box of powder. It was only flour, and in the other a bird cage with a flying fish in it, which was meant to be a sea bird. Miss Neptune's lips had been made red with fruit juice, and she sat and powdered herself all the time. She also had a big looking-glass, and sat looking at herself all the time. It was Alfred who had dressed up like that, and that was very nice because he acts comic parts so well. He had also made himself a big bosom with the help of 2 pillows from the lockers. Then came the doctor. He was black all over with tar and naked to the waist, and he wore a pair of bathing drawers. Besides these, he was wearing a fine bowler hat belonging to father and an English moustache. He had a rifle slung across his shoulders. In one hand he was holding a box of pills, and in the other a bucket of tar. I have forgotten to mention that Neptune wore a pair of glasses on his nose and a big pipe in his mouth, the doctor's tar, but we were not told this till after we had been baptized, was really a mixture of soot, coffee grounds, pepper, salt, flour, and a little black paint. His razor was made of wood, and was 2 meters long when opened out. The doctor's pills were made of a mixture of dough, pepper, mustard, curry powder, and salt, and it was Christensen who was the doctor. Then Neptune asked which of us hadn't crossed the line. We all answered him, and then we were sent below while Jensen was being baptized. Soon after, we were called up again, and now we were going to be baptized. Neptune's doctor took hold of Mother to begin with, and she got a hefty lump of tar right in the face, and as Neptune asked her a question at the same time, and she couldn't answer for tar, Mother got another splash straight in the face, while the doctor shouted in a voice so loud that it might have been heard at home in Denmark, "Hell's bells! Can't you answer?" And I wonder that no one at home heard him. This happened several times, and then Mother had to be shaved. When that was done, the doctor wanted to see Mother's teeth, and now his tarry hands went into her mouth, and at the same time she got one of his pills. Ugh! Mother had to chew it, because the doctor stood over her with his bucket of tar. Once again she got a little splash in the face, when she least expected it, and then she was suddenly pushed over backwards into a sail full of water, which was hung up behind her, and all her clothes got wet. We others went through the same treatment, only we rubbed much worse with tar. Jan and Tur were quite naked, so they were rubbed all over their bodies, and we others were naked to the waist. Finally Neptune said that we should certainly get our certificates of baptism when he had time to write them out, but he was rather busy ruling his kingdom. I must not forget to say that when we had been tarred properly, we were shaved with the doctor's hard razor. It was gruesome. I should also have told that when Mother explained that she had been baptized Helga Thorne when she was a baby, Miss Neptune answered, "It's awful that I should have got a thorn in my eye." One afternoon, when we were just about to drink our lime juice, a cooling drink in hot weather, the cook saw a sea slug in the water. It was about 3 meters long. A sea slug is a sausage-shaped, slimy animal which drifts around in the water. Father said that he had never seen such a long sea slug. We tried to catch it with the boat hook, but we were too late. It was so hot now that we had to wear hats so as not to get sunstroke, and we usually had shower baths twice a day. When we were about to have a shower bath, we would quickly get out of our clothes. They were only a pair of knickers, but Jan and Tur usually wore a thin woolen vest as well. When we had a shower, we wore neither bathing cap nor bathing costume, because they are not necessary at sea. Sometimes water would be poured over us for 10 minutes. Then Christmas came. We had a Christmas tree because Carl bored holes in an old oar and put sticks in them. Mother and I covered the tree with green tissue paper, and then we decorated it so that it really looked like a proper Christmas tree. On Christmas Day, the table was laid and decorated, and the whole saloon was also decorated. We had both a white tablecloth and a Christmas cloth on top. There were also Christmas serviettes with Father Christmases printed on them. We had hung up streamers across the saloon. The Christmas tree stood in a corner with the presents behind it, and 3 big Father Christmases in front, and under the tree were lying some Christmas magazines. Jensen announced Christmas on the ship's bell, and in the evening we had a lovely party. Christensen and Carl found the almond in the rice porridge. In Denmark, you always have rice porridge at Christmas, and there is an almond in it, and the one who finds the almond gets a present. Christensen and Carl each got half an almond and were given a bar of chocolate. After the rice porridge, we had corned beef, and then came a jam sponge cake, on which was written in sugar, "Merry Christmas." Alfred had made it. Before starting to eat, we sang some carols, and after dinner, we sang some more, and then the presents were given out. We each got a chocolate heart, and we also got some other Christmas sweets, which Alfred had made. But while the presents were being given out, the Christmas tree suddenly caught fire, so we had to carry it up on deck. When the fire had been put out, we went below again, and Mother and I played on the piano for the others. We had to start school again on the first Saturday after Christmas, but that was because we had had much longer summer holidays than the children in other schools.